I remember growing up listening to my grandfather. My grandfather was drafted into World War II, into the Army. He didn't talk a lot about the things he saw in World War II, but there were some things he talked about, and I was just amazed by a lot of the stories. I went to Bakersfield High School, and I joined junior ROTC my sophomore year. And I think that was what really started me, leading me towards the path to the military. I didn't want to take PE. I hated having to change out for gym class. So if you took junior ROTC, you didn't have to take gym. So I joined my sophomore year. My parents, were fine with it. And every Thursday we wore uniforms, but really started getting that structure that the military would provide. By my senior year, I wasn't real sure what I was going to do. I thought my parents had some magical college plan waiting for me. I had taken the ASVAB, they offered it, and I just took it to get out of class. But I scored really high. I had been accepted to Georgia Military College, but my scholarship wasn't going to be enough to cover. So after school one day, I went to the recruiter's office and I said, I want to sign up. And he said, okay. Well, I was 17 at the time. I was late getting home from school that day because I had gone to sign up, filled out the paperwork, got home, and my dad was mad. You did what? And I said, yeah, I signed up for the Air Force today. I need you and Mom to go down tomorrow since I'm a minor. I need you guys to sign the paperwork. Ooh, my dad blew up. That's not happening, blah, 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 on and on. And I remember my mom. My mom was always the calm. And she said, I'll talk to him. So they went down and met with the recruiter, and they had some questions of their own, and they signed the paperwork. I entered the Air Force 2 weeks before my 18th birthday and had my birthday in boot camp. So I did my boot camp. Parents came out for graduation and brought my brother, and surprised me that they brought my grandmother. I thought they were bringing my ex-boyfriend or something. And my mom just kept saying, we've got a surprise for you. Well, when I got tapped on the shoulder and I turned around, it was my grandmother. And I lost it. I made it a point. I always called my grandmother. It didn't matter where I was at in the world. I called my grandmother as long as I could every Wednesday. And she knew I was calling every Wednesday. I got orders to Travis Air Force Base. I ended up in cargo. I learned how to drive a forklift, all this in tech school, It was a lot of packing and crating and loading trucks, unloading trucks. You had to learn how to drive different types of equipment because you didn't know what you were going to be loading. I was now driving a semi, and loading them up and backing them up and everything else. And 4 through 24K forklift, a crane, different pieces of military equipment that generally the air transportation side, they would load the equipment up into the aircraft. But out in the yards, we had to be able to move them around. I volunteered before. They asked for volunteers, and I said, sure. That's when I ended up, they said, okay, you're going to learn how to drive the locomotive. I'm like, what do you mean drive a locomotive? Sure enough, there is a train track that goes through Travis Air Force Base. And usually about once or twice a year, you were the conductor. Working in my career field, there's also another side of it. It wasn't just packing tools and equipment. I did go to hazmat school. Part of that was I did deal with dead bodies. I remember when I worked grave shift overnight, that's generally when the bodies would come in, and we'd line up in the warehouse if the families were there to receive the bodies of their loved ones. They'd come through, they were covered with the American flag. It's one thing when it's a retiree who's lived their life and it still obviously still hurts, to see somebody go through that. It's their family member. It's a different thing when it's a child, when it's somebody that was my age. So families weren't always there to receive them. Usually the base mortician was waiting, but not always. Sometimes we had to stand guard with the body until the mortician got there. That's when it really started kind of getting to me. You saw things that you never really forget. We had military exercises that would take place on base. And during one of those exercises, we're thinking this is all just part of the exercise. And then we got notification from command post that there had been a bombing overseas. And it was the Khobar Towers bombing. And that our exercise had now turned to real world. They had a group of us that were going to go there to bring the bodies home. And I went. You'd see transfer case, the same person's name, but transfer case 1 of 2, 1 of 3. And it didn't click why we had 3 transfer cases for the same person until later. Because as they would find different parts. I was 18, 19 years old at the time. I never told anybody that any of that was part of my job. But that leads into the more darker time of my service. Something that most women don't talk about, most men even that go through it in the service, is military sexual trauma. Everything that I thought I knew was ripped out from below me. And the people I thought that would be there to support me, that would believe me, weren't. I still remember the morning I went to work, and I was there early, and Sergeant Rivera, I still remember, was my supervisor. And his whole face just dropped. And he's like, I got to get you to the hospital. I remember being humiliated again when I got to the hospital. Because, every woman who's just been through the most traumatic thing in their life now has a 18-year-old airman come in to take pictures of you. They gave me 3 days to get over it. I got called into my commander's office. And I'll never forget him sitting there in front of me saying, well, Airman Valente, this is not the first time. You're not the first person this has ever happened to, and you won't be the last, unfortunately. So you just need to suck it up and press on. And I remember making that phone call to my parents. My mom, and it was actually my father's boss, came up to get me, to bring me home for a couple of days. Because they were afraid of what my father might do if he got up there. And I slept the entire ride back to Bakersfield. And my best friend and 2 of them came here to be with me. And I just slept. I went back to the base, and my whole world had fallen apart at that point. The looks, like I did something wrong. At that point, I remember asking my mom and dad, I said, I need out of here. I can't stay here. So my parents opened a congressional investigation. It was Bill Thomas at the time, was the congressman. I don't think he realizes he saved my life. I came to find out that I was one of 8 women in the last 4 months that had happened to. Not by him, but I was the only one that stayed in. The day that my congressional investigation was concluded and they granted me a transfer off the base, I remember I went to get new orders, and they said, okay, you've been granted a transfer to a different base, but you're going to have to move yourself. We're not paying for it. So I was transferred to Vandenberg. My parents came up to Travis, helped me, loaded everything up. Nobody knew why I was there. It's very rare to get a transfer from a base to a base like that, especially within the same state. So when I had shown up, I remember my master sergeant saying, "Why are you here? We had no notice that we were getting any new troops. You know, we're already at capacity." I said, "They didn't tell you?" And he said, "No." So then I had to tell him. And he said, "Are you going to be a problem?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to be a problem." I think that made me work even harder to hide everything. But on the anniversary, it hit me. It hit me hard. And I remember coming home and for the weekend, because Bakersfield's not that far from the base, and it was Mother's Day weekend. And I still remember sitting in the backyard with my dad. And he said, "You've changed." And I said, "I know, Dad." It broke my heart because I had. But there wasn't anybody I could talk to about it. They gave me 6 months to get over it, or they were going to discharge me. I remember meeting with the Inspector General again, and he gave me hard news, but in a more compassionate way as a father. I still remember going into his office and he said, "Airman Valente, I know I've read everything and I understand exactly where you're coming from in certain aspects. You want him prosecuted. I get it." He said, "But at some point you're going to have to ask yourself, do you want to move on with your life? Or do you want to keep living through this?" And I said, "I just want to move on with my life." He said, "And I think it's time to just let this go." What can you say to that? So I let it go. I had applied to become a drill sergeant. It was either that or go into the Air National Guard. I got out and came back to Bakersfield. I wanted to finish college. My gear was still packed up behind my bedroom door. I moved back home to my parents' house. And my mom came in and said, "You better turn on your TV." And I said, "What?" So I turned it on. The first plane was going through on September 11th. So I told my mom, I was like, "I got to go." Because of my career field and things like that, I actually worked out of LAX. When I got out, I was going to Bakersfield College. I was finishing up my AA degree there. And then I transferred to Cal State Bakersfield. I graduated, got my bachelor's in criminology with a minor in psychology. And I started working for the state. I had my first daughter, Ashley, and I had her in 2013. She has Down syndrome. Our second daughter, I had her in 2016. I had to have Gianna through IVF. And it was at that time, meeting with the infertility specialist and everything, that we talked more about my military career and the type things that I was exposed to, both chemicals, all kinds of stuff. But I was fortunate. I was able to have two beautiful little girls, and they keep me on my toes, but I wouldn't have it any other way. I started law school in February of 2019. I graduated in 2023. I never imagined I would have a JD. I had a really hard time when I got out because I didn't know any other veterans. There wasn't Facebook. There weren't veterans groups that I knew of. I didn't know any other female vets. I didn't know any other vets at all. So I felt very isolated. They had at the vet center here locally a group for female veterans, and I met them there. And we talked about how there's a Facebook group for all veterans, but there's nothing for women veterans. And I like, let's create our own. And we did. Just to have a group where we can talk about things that are specific to us, things we dealt with. We take care of each other. And I think that camaraderie, whether male or female, always stays with you. With everything good and bad that happened to me in the service, if I had it to do all over again, would I have done it? Even with everything that I've been through. And I don't hesitate to say absolutely. Because even with those bad things that happened, I wouldn't be the person I am today. I wouldn't hesitate to do it all over again.